Okay, today we're going to start chapter 25, which is about the Jazz Age. So it's the 20s, 1920 to 1929. All right, the first lesson, chapter 25, lesson 1, is called Time of Turmoil. One of the big things that's happening during this time is a fear of radicalism, means radical ideas. So after World War I, people in America are really suspicious of foreigners and people having different views. If you remember, there was a communist takeover in Russia. Remember the Bolsheviks? And people were very suspicious of and fearful of communism coming to America because it is so different than what we believe here in the United States about communists did not think people should be able to own businesses and things privately, that it should be government run. And so, that kind of goes against our capitalist ideas in America. That Russian Revolution starts making us very worried and fearing it coming here. The other main, radical idea that's getting a lot of popularity is an idea called um, anarchists. The people are called anarchists. And anarchists believe that there should be no government, and they resist government even violently. It's okay to violently resist the government. And so we had a series of bombings, and I have a little video about it to show you. And so you can understand that the bombings would scare Americans, and they felt like it was these radical people who were causing these problems, and so they were okay with some um, going after them in turn. So this started an idea that's called the Red Scare. The name Red Scare comes from the term Reds was used for communists because of their red flag. And so the government actually started going after people that they thought were communists or anarchists. And the two people that get the most, attention for this was the Attorney General, Palmer, and his deputy at the time was J. Edgar Hoover, which you may know Hoover is eventually going to become a president. So that's why I mentioned that. They started having these raids, and they would arrest people, and they would take things from their homes. They would burn like propaganda, that communists or anarchists had. And so they kind of went after them, and a lot of people were arrested. Some people were deported. And so these raids are often called Palmer raids after the Attorney General who okayed them. And so there was this really bad feeling of or suspicion of people who were different foreigners, or these, especially if you were vocal about having these communist or anarchist views. Uh, at one point they were even saying we're doing these raids because they have weapons, right? They could be violent. There should be fair. There should be reported that they never did find any big supplies of weapons. But it was this fear that was fueled by some of the bombings and maybe a little, extreme overreaction. But they did arrest a lot of people, and some were deported. Deported means expelled from the country. That's if they were aliens. Of course, I don't mean aliens like from Mars. I mean alien is a term for a person who is a foreigner. So the foreigners were definitely, targeted and seen as suspicious. Here's an example of that. This is the very famous case of Sacco and Vanzetti. They were two Italian men who were immigrants and were anarchists. So of course, the two things that people are feeling very suspicious of. They were accused of killing two men during a robbery, and they were convicted and put to death. And they had a lot of protests at the time in Massachusetts because people felt like they didn't really get a very fair trial, and that they were basically, accused because of their views and because they were immigrants. So this is a time of nativism in the United States, right? Remember that idea we talked about from World War I, that it was really about like believing that, your group is the right group and should be the one who's has the power. Well, in this case, we're talking like Americans felt like Americans are the right group, and these natives, I'm sorry, these foreigners or these radical people were not like okay to be here. Okay. All right. And then this also leads in the 20s to a time of terrible labor unrest. And so, if you remember, we talked about during World War I how because they wanted not to have strikes and things for the war effort, the government had helped make sure that some of the working hours were fair and the wages, things like that. Well, after the war, those bureaus go away and things basically go back to how they were before. And so people are very unhappy that they're having to work 12-hour work days and things. And so they start to form labor unions and try to have strikes. Now, of course, the company is not liking strikes because if they're striking, they can't be working, right? And they are causing a lot of trouble, they would think, of the company, right? By demanding like picketing outside, not letting anyone come in to work and convincing people not to go to work so that the company will feel the pressure, right? Because they're losing money every day. They're not providing, making their goods. And so that pressure they hoped would convince them to give in to their demands of having, more reasonable work hours or fair pay, things like that. So there's a few terrible examples during this time. Unfortunately, this kind of upheaval and a lot of it was again propaganda. The companies portrayed this as it was a communist uprising, right? It was communists who were fueling this labor unrest, right? Because remember, communists don't think that private companies should exist. So they would say that you should rise up, right? And so there's a few examples of famous ones. This one of the big ones was the steelworker strike, where the steelworkers tried to band together throughout the country. And again, like the steel company didn't want to stand for this. They thought the labor unions were terrible. They, you did a media blitz, so again, like trying to make them sound like the bad guys, the strikers. And they hired strike breakers, people who are willing to cross the picket line and go do the job and kind of take the place of the strikers. And if you can get enough strike breakers to do that, then you can basically, fire your original and break the strike, and the strikers lose their power, right? And a lot of times it was black strike breakers who were willing to do this, right? Remember we talked about how so many African Americans have moved up north to the cities trying to get jobs. And so this, of course, is going to add to race problems, right? Where people, the whites, of course, are going to feel like these, African Americans are like their enemy, and some race riots happened. So that's what happened in the steelworkers strike. The steelworkers were trying to demand better pay and an 8-hour limit to their workday. They were accused of being Reds, right? And unfortunately, that media blitz and everything, and the scary feeling of the Red Scare, the public kind of believed it and went with it, and so the strikers were kind of seen as being the bad guys. And the race riot that happened because of the black strike breakers, it kind of came to a head in a riot in Indiana, Gary, Indiana, and 8 strikers ended up dying, and they ended up sending in troops, the governor did, to stop it. And unfortunately, like the people like thought that it was good that the governor did that, right? To kind of make it safe. But that means that, um, that people, oh, I'm getting actually confused. That was the Boston strike. I think that what has happened. Yeah. Okay. So the 18 strikers died in the first one I was talking about. I started talking about the Boston strike. Okay, so the Boston strike was for police officers, and police officers got paid very poorly too, and they were trying to strike for some rights, and they wanted to form a union, and unions are, of course, are portrayed as being negative. And it was this one that the governor called out the National Guard to stop, because what happened was when the police stopped working, they, people took advantage of them not being there, and there was like a few nights of unrest, and people having a crime spree. And so the governor, Calvin Coolidge, calls out the National Guard, and he um, gets it to stop and to be peaceful again. And this actual picture is from him. That's Calvin Coolidge on the right. That's the National Guard, and he's checking to see if they're ready to go stop the strike. So unfortunately, the police officers were seen as the bad guys in this, and the people applauded the governor for doing this, and they actually ended up firing all the policemen who had participated in the strike. And so so you can tell public opinion is not in favor of the workers' rights right now because of the time of unrest, feeling they don't like that. Calvin Coolidge eventually, later that year in 1920, is actually going to run for vice president too. So that's another name you'll know. All right, and then this other example here is of the Pullman cars. They were able to unionize. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters is what their union was called. It was African American railroad workers, and they also wanted to make a fair wage and things, and they had to work long hours, and then some of it, like, they had to get ready for work, and that part wasn't paid, so they ended up working a lot of hours kind of unpaid. And so they wanted to band together. A. Philip Randolph is the person who gets credit for starting this, and it becomes successful. And so he becomes a civil rights activist in the 20s. And they're trying to get labor unions to be seen as something that is fair, right? Because you're just banding together to demand, to be treated fairly. And it is true that, like, the companies, took advantage. And some of the companies, there's even terrible stories of them, having people like to intimidate people just so they wouldn't strike, or beating people up who were like, saying that they were trying to be like a labor leader. And if you were, so it's not like either side is totally without some, you could see it both ways, right? Like the companies might have gone too far, but also then striking, if it ends up in rioting, you could see that that's a problem too. Okay, so anyway, the short story is labor unions are like linked with that idea of radicalism. And so unions are not very popular at this time because of all the pressure they got from the companies not to have them. And so they're not very popular in the 20s. Okay. All right. And then, like I mentioned, there's a lot of racial unrest happening in the 20s too. So in the South, I'm sure you've talked about this in English class too. I know a lot of you do. There's a lot of lynching happening, right? More than 70 African Americans have been lynched. And in the North, because of the Great Migration, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of competition for jobs. And so African Americans are resented by the whites in the North too. And so here's another riot that happens, a famous race riot in Chicago. Interesting. It started off as, an African American teenager who was in a raft and he floated down. He couldn't swim, but he floated down in Lake Michigan to like the white side of the. They had very like unofficial like which blocks are black blocks and which ones are white blocks, and he went down the beach too far into the white area, and the whites didn't like it, and they started throwing rocks at him, and one hits him in the head, and he ends up drowning. And then of course the African Americans are very understandably unhappy that this teenager was killed in this way, and the police wouldn't do anything, and so there's riots happening, right? Like we talked about, has been happening around here in the United States pretty recently, right? So for about 2 weeks, there's a lot of unrest and rioting happening in Chicago. The different gangs are, fighting, and there's a lot of killing going on. In about 2 weeks, 15 whites are killed and 23 African Americans, and a lot more are hurt. And so that was a terrible riot set off by the killing of one person, just like we've been, talking about recently in the news. All right, and then other person talking about racial leaders. This is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, what became a popular leader, he was actually originally from Jamaica, and he did a lot to promote African American like pride and achievement and work in New York a lot. And they did try to like improve and do a lot for African American businesses and getting economic strength in New York. He was actually against integration, meaning whites and Africans living, together. He actually thought they're two different, you should be separate. In fact, he supported the Back to Africa movement. I don't know if you remember. That was the idea that there should be part of Africa. Liberia was the place to establish a nation on the west coast of Africa for African Americans, right? People who were of African descent but live in Africa, that they should go back to Africa. So he actually thought that was a good idea. And so your book mentions and focuses on the fact that he was instrumental in starting the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and he did do a lot to help improve African Americans. And I think the only thing I wish the book had said a little bit about was that he also was seen as pretty radical kind of himself, right? Like, for instance, he was okay with working with some KKK people because he agreed with the idea that Africans and whites should not be together, just like the KKK does, right? So he got some definitely criticized for, daring to, talk to those people, and seeming like you're working with them seems bad, right? So he was a pretty, he did do a lot, but he also was pretty divisive person too. Okay.